Welcome to another episode of Kitchen Sink Dharma, and today is really about how sometimes we leave parts of ourselves behind when we practice meditation, and there are parts that we shut down and we stop listening to. And there are parts of ourselves that we choose not to share with the world. There are patterns, there are beliefs that we don't even want to acknowledge to ourselves, never mind to anybody else. And today I want to talk about what we resist and what we ignore in ourselves. There are aspects of our personality that we hide away. There are parts that we have abandoned. And this is not something we need to feel bad about. It's not because we're uniquely flawed. We're not faulty. We're just simply human. And however we feel about those parts of ourselves, they're there. They might be buried deep. They might be at the level of our most entrenched invisible habits and patterns. But they're what fuel much of our resistance, much of our daily struggle against reality. And sometimes they're inactive, but it doesn't take much to activate them. These are the things that drive an awful lot of our suffering and our dissatisfaction. So we'd like to think that we're in control of all of our thoughts, and that our conscious mind can decide what we're going to think and how we're going to behave and so on. But of course it doesn't quite work like that. It's not as simple as that. And that's why if we're going to wake up, we need to get over the idea that willpower is all that's required. We also need a little bit of humility, because a lot of our mental activity is going on outside of our conscious awareness. Much of it happens without our knowing much about it. And much of what drives us is actually rooted way back in our past. So many of our patterns, many of our behaviours come from old wounds. So if you've ever felt that you weren't good enough, if you've ever sought the approval of other people, if you've ever needed to be the one that's right or the one that wins the argument, these are all deeply imprinted. These are all very old patterns, old needs. And so is our hostility, our habit of focusing on other people's faults, and the way that we separate ourselves off from the world in order to feel safe, and also the way that we split everything and everyone that we meet into good and bad. All of this comes from deep within us. And we can try to ignore our hidden side, or we can try and bury it deeper. But the more we try and do that, the greater its capacity to just cause more disruption in our lives. And it can affect our relationships, it can inhibit our creativity, it can sap our energy. But it also actually has immense value, because there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity for growth, for exploration, for awakening. If we can uncover and accept and start to integrate those hidden parts of ourselves, we can start to know and accept ourselves, whereas cutting ourselves off from them also cuts us off from our true nature, which is to be loving and open. So at the time of the Buddha, there were a lot of different wandering spiritual seekers trying to connect with their true nature or their being. And thousands of years before anybody had heard of Freud or Jung or anybody like that, they had an understanding of the unconscious mind. And they realized that for most people there's little control over the mind and its impulses, and that the experience of every thought and every sensation, every object is mixed up with associations and distortions. And they understood all that. They understood about painful psychological processes that derive their power from unconscious patterns. There was a different set of language about it, but they understood it. There were countless teachings and practices that were aimed at enabling the yogi to master their own mind. 2,500 years ago, in the area around the Ganges, where the Buddha lived for much of his life, people didn't actually know about genes. They didn't have our understanding of child development, of attachment theory, and so on. Their understanding was that our resistance and our suffering were based on karma or kama. In other words, the result of actions in this life and previous lives that accumulated over generations. And this was the belief system that existed when Gautama, the future Buddha, sought enlightenment. So his teachings reflect that world and its assumptions, although he also challenged many of those assumptions. So according to his teachings, our deepest underlying tendencies are mostly invisible to us, and much of the time we're completely unaware of them. And he didn't see them as something that we can easily fix. So the way that he taught for working with them is through the Eightfold Path, including through mindfulness and meditation. Now, modern psychology would suggest there are alternative ways in, for example, therapy, or a Jungian might talk about shadow work. But however we approach these parts of ourselves, we're not going to change anything overnight. Now, according to Buddhist psychology, the deepest, the most intractable pattern is something called avidya, in other words, delusion or confusion. It's our inability to see things for what they are. And this isn't just about not knowing, it's also sometimes about not wanting to know, about finding it too painful to know. So part of the reason that we don't see our deepest patterns is that we don't really want to see them. We're so attached to them because they're what's familiar, and they feel like they're part of us. So even if we're aware of them, our knowledge often remains as head knowledge. They're so woven into our sense of self that we can't really imagine life without them. And most people have thoughts and feelings that they don't want to deal with. Either consciously or unconsciously, we turn away from some parts of ourselves, some thoughts that come up. Even if we can't see them directly, we do see them manifested in patterns, so recurring stories that reveal the parts that we've hidden and repressed. And we get a glimpse of them when we react to the people and the circumstances around us. And this is important because it gives us an opening. So it gives us an opportunity to know ourselves when we're actually activated. So our reactivity is actually a window into this hidden world, this hidden part of us. And it reveals parts of us that are asking to be seen. So if you ever notice yourself reacting to somebody else, maybe feeling annoyed but not being able to admit it, or projecting all sorts of feelings onto somebody else, or maybe ruminating about something, maybe there's just a thought that won't go away. There's an opportunity there to learn something about yourself, and it might be time to shift your attention from the outside world back inside. And just because our patterns are hidden, it doesn't mean that we can't know them. So if we're really willing to be honest with ourselves, we can tell when the ego is defending itself. We know in order to be able to cope with this knowing and use it as fuel for growth, we need to be sufficiently resourced and grounded. We need to be quite gentle with those tender parts of ourselves. And then we can bring mindfulness to our experience. Now, one of the modes of mindfulness that there is involves very wide open awareness. So in other words, being open to everything in your experience, mind, body, thoughts, feelings, and so on. And when we're in that mode, it's much less likely that we're going to disown any part of ourselves. It's like shining a light into every corner of the room and then fully experiencing whatever comes up in the mind and body, which isn't easy. It makes us feel vulnerable, and it can often go against years of conditioning because it exposes a certain amount of discomfort. And that's why we can't just do it straight away. We have to practice. We have to ease into it. And this means just keeping on coming back, keeping going. So whether or not it feels like it's going well, it's all practice. If we're sitting trying to meditate, for example, and we're feeling unable to escape a bad mood or a nagging thought, that's practice. As long as we're aware of it, it's practice. As soon as we stop resisting our moods and thoughts, then we can open up to our experience. Then our practice changes. It's no longer an exercise in building up the ego. It's just simply an opening, simply a window into ourselves. And we're learning to open up to tension or desire or uncertainty, anxiety, dissatisfaction, whatever is going on. We're opening up to the non-verbal, visceral part of our experience. And we're not meditating to escape these things. We're not meditating in order to avoid experiencing them. So if we can stay close to our experience in our meditation practice, we get better at doing the same in other parts of our lives. If we can confront our shadows, if you like, our hidden parts, in safety and solitude while we sit on a cushion, we can start to lower our defense mechanisms more generally and really truly connect with life. Now, one of the stories around the Buddha's journey of awakening involves him recollecting an episode from his childhood. And in the village where he lived, there was a ceremonial ploughing of the fields at the start of the planting season. And as a young child, he sat under a tree and he watched the men ploughing, and he noticed the young grass being pulled up and the insects and the worms being destroyed by the plough. And he was filled with sadness, and he felt a young child's spontaneous compassion for the creatures being harmed. And there was a a melting away of the sense of separation. The activities of the ego subsided, if you like. And he was said to have gone into a state of deep meditation, a state of jhana, as the word is. And in recollecting this episode as an adult, he was inspired to keep going, because he'd unsuccessfully sought awakening through extreme practices, ascetic practices. And he realized there was another way, and he remembered that as a child he'd achieved that sense of wholeness and connection quite easily, simply by connecting with his own feelings of sadness and meeting suffering with compassion. So we don't need to be afraid of suffering. All that we need to do is just to meet it with some compassion, with some kindness. And by that I mean our own suffering, but also the suffering of other beings. So we avoid and we repress and we hide parts of ourselves because we don't want to feel uncomfortable. We don't want to suffer. And when we do, we experience it as if it was a mistake. We think there's something wrong. We think maybe we're faulty. But actually there's nothing wrong. We do suffer. We do encounter suffering. We're human. And actually for most of us there's a gap between who we are and who we think we're supposed to be. But if we could actually see ourselves completely and unconditionally, there would be no gap. If we could just meet ourselves and see ourselves with unconditional compassion, we'd have nothing to hide from ourselves. So that's this week's episode, and thanks as always for listening. I hope you can join me again next time.